All right, to me, this is the last Saturday before school starts up again for you, and I've just finished Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Um, this is another one of those classics that I think people think that they've read or have like seen adaptations or read like snippets of it or excerpts of it in classes, and then go, oh, I fully understand what this is about. I think it's very much along the same lines as Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, in that sense, in which, because it is such a common turn of phrase in the English language and such a common figure, that a lot of people just think that they understand what it is without reading it in its actual language, right? Of course, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, very famously, one of the big boons for science fiction in general and for women writers. And for that, obviously, it's going to be very, very popular. Science fiction in of itself, this is certainly a boon for it, and it exists in a sense. But for the English literature, I would argue that science fiction doesn't really pop off and make a really big, doesn't become like a mainstream culture, a mainstream type of literature until postmodernism. Just because those kind of ideas that are out there, certainly I just don't think that there's enough literature and enough popularity up until postmodernism to really say that's the mainstream genre. Up until then, certainly I can certainly be proven wrong with that, but through what I've seen and what I've read, that's my interpretation of that. So that's that. Novel itself, right? It's told once again in a very interesting way, like a lot of these kind of gothic stories are told, gothic horror stories, because it is actually told from Walton, who is an absolute nobody. He's basically a captain on an expedition to get to the North Pole, runs across Frankenstein, who is the creator. Frankenstein is chasing the monster on sled, but is super, super ill. Comes to the ship that has now been frozen in ice because when they started going up. And the story is then told to Walton. Walton writes it down. So we have Walton, who's our actual narrator. We then have Frankenstein, who is not a doctor. He is just a person who is studying. At that point, the idea of doctorates and masters, I don't think comes or doesn't come for a little bit longer, I don't think. It doesn't, there's like a weird thing with education in which there's a key point in which basically the idea of a master's degree was just like, oh, if you just study here for another 2 years, no matter what, and you just pay us, we'll give you a master's degree. I think that started to come around at this time, but that's a whole other thing. All right, that's a whole other thing about education. So Frankenstein, really interested in natural sciences and natural philosophy, basically conjures up a way to create the monster. And then in the immediate creation of the monster, realizes the abhorrence that he has created, and abandons the monster. And then the monster is forced to then attempt to live its own life without any sort of guidance without any understanding of what humanity is. And then we get into this whole situation in which the monster is exacting revenge on Frankenstein to basically exact revenge on the creation in the first place, right? So the way the story is told is we have Walton, and then we have Frankenstein telling his story to Walton, and then I think it's about 5 chapter section in the middle, there is the monster telling his story to Frankenstein, who in turn is telling it to Walton. So there's layers of separation there. It's just, in that sense, it's a really intriguing style of novel, especially when we get to kind of interpretations of it, which I'll get to towards a little bit. But obviously, I think the first big interpretation of this comes from really, I think, 2 points. There's the science fiction standpoint, and what later generations of science fiction really use science fiction for, which is to comment on the state of humanity and its drive for betterment. And then there's also comment, I think, from the humanities perspective. From a science fiction perspective, right? And you're looking at this through a lot of what Ray Bradbury does with science fiction, which is use science fiction as a lens to demonstrate the issues of humanity. And so basically my interpretation of it, right, is this overall idea that what we create can become better than us. And in that sense, right, Frankenstein and the monster have this conversation at one point, which is when the monster tries to convince Frankenstein to create a wife for him. And basically it kind of ends with this idea that the monster's saying to Frankenstein, you are my creator, but I'm your master. And really it's kind of that driving home that fear of, if we don't think about the repercussions of what we are creating through either, whether it be a scientific lens or anything else, if we don't think about the repercussions of what we're doing, what we're creating, well then sometimes it gets out of control and it dominates us in a way that can never be understood, right? And I think the clearest example of that in real life would be the atom bomb, right? Manhattan Project was not specifically designed to create the atom bomb. It was designed to create a way to harness the energy, which then translates directly into the atom bomb, right? There's then Robert Oppenheimer, who says the I am become death, which, fair enough, I guess, Oppenheimer. But then really what it does, right, the history of the atom bomb, we then escalate into the US versus the USSR in the Cold War, and the idea that of mutual destruction, right? Of this thing that we have created harnesses so much energy and is so destructive that the only way to be safe from it, because the other person also has it, is to create more of them, right? That is almost an exact parallel to what Mary Shelley has written in Frankenstein, in which the creation of a single entity and a single monster that is larger and more destructive than any singular human being ever could be, and can be destructive in a way that does not make sense for humans. The only way to be protected from it is to create another of it. An absolutely wild parallel between the two things, right? That Mary Shelley Frankenstein effectively predicts the idea of mutual destruction almost a century before it's officially made a term. I don't remember the exact year that Mary Shelley wrote this. Yeah. So that's the science fiction standpoint of this, right? From a humanities standpoint, big thing that I think we usually get to take away from it is this idea that you have to be a parent to a child, right? All of this comes from this entire novel. All of the issues stem from the fact that Frankenstein was so obsessed with the idea of creation and seeing where this leads to, that he did not stop to think about how he would actually raise a creation. And so when the monster is animated, Frankenstein abandons it immediately, because Frankenstein has no idea how to even think about controlling or raising this thing, right? And like, that's the whole thing. At the very end of the novel, you get this whole thing of the monster basically cursing Frankenstein for creating him, and that all of the miseries that have befallen both of them stem from this idea that Frankenstein did not ever stop to think or ever care in that initial moment as to what happened to the monster. So that's a huge deal, right? And a lot of the monster's narration through that middle chapters is really this idea of the monster is a grown being that somehow has to learn the same ways as a child does, and eventually has to go through the entirety of human evolution and human knowledge to get to this point, right? So I think that's really kind of I would say a lot of the modern interpretations of the novel, right? It's this idea of, if you are a creator, you are in charge of your creation, right? Time this was written, I mean, obviously, right, lots of children being born, and a lot of them with the idea that they're going to be put to work, because that's what children did. And that's why you had children, right? That's why farms historically have had so many children, is because they are effectively free labor for the farm. At least that is what I've been told throughout my educational experience, is that's part of the reasoning. And so really Mary Shelley's, in modern interpretation, Mary Shelley is pointing out that idea of, if all you're doing is creating for the sake of creation and creating for the sake of having another thing around, well, then you're creating monsters in your own right, because you're not raising them to be children. You're not raising them to be functional adults. You're raising them to be monsters, because you're not raising them at all. Which I think is really kind of the overwhelming kind of reaction to Frankenstein. However, I do think that there's actually a more in-book representation of what Mary Shelley's trying to explain, and that is Mary Shelley's thinking, or the belief, that pretty privilege exists. And in the way the novel describes it, I wouldn't even call it pretty privilege. I would call it normalcy is the greatest advantage to anyone in the world, right? Because what we constantly see happen through the monster's eyes and through Frankenstein's eyes and through Walton's eyes is that the monster is being put into a situation in which he is more well-spoken and more reliably intelligent in a way than the people around him. But because the monster is so wretched and so disgusting to look at, the monster is immediately turned away. Right? Like, I mean, that's probably the biggest takeaway from all of that, is that the monster, no matter how intelligent, no matter how much he's studied and learned and did a whole bunch of the extra work, right? All of this going back to Frankenstein's narrative when he was observing the family. No matter how much work he did, the monster did, no matter how much work the monster did, the monster was never going to be accepted in society because of the way the monster looked. Which is huge, right? And then even when we get to this ending part, right, the last few chapters in which Frankenstein becomes so obsessed with the monster, and then the monster kills Elizabeth, and then Frankenstein sets out on his last journey to try and take revenge on the monster, right? Throughout all of this, Frankenstein is using almost exactly the same logic and is even reusing some of the ideology that the monster has used up to this point. I don't remember the exact quote, but there's chapter 22, I think. There's almost an exact recreation of no, not chapter 22, chapter 23, I think. There's almost an exact recreation of one of the monster's ideas, and Frankenstein says it almost directly word for word, right? And it's this idea that Frankenstein has become the exact same monster that the monster has in these final scenes, right? The problem is that Frankenstein is a normal person. The monster is not. And so throughout all of this chasing, right, throughout all of this, the monster has to be constantly hidden away and constantly hide and forage for everything, while Frankenstein is allowed to just do as he pleases as he's chasing after the monster. And it's all because Frankenstein is normal enough to be seen, whereas the monster is not. And even when we get to the very, very end, where we switch back to Walton's perspective, and Walton is trying to, is reacting to both the words of Frankenstein and the eventual words of the monster. Frankenstein is using the exact same eloquence and persuasiveness that the monster ends up using. Use it beat for beat, displays the exact same knowledge, but the difference is Frankenstein looks normal. Frankenstein looks what we expect a person to look like. Whereas the monster is 8 feet tall and looks hideous. And so our internalized belief is to always believe and trust the normalcy and the thing that looks like us, rather than look at the hideous creature and believe them. Right? This look at humanities, right? In in this ending part, to me, really is a comment by Mary Shelley on the idea of classism and racism. I certainly can't prove that, but by looking at the similarities between Frankenstein and the monster, we can see that at a deeper level, at the ending, they are nearly identical. But Walton, who is the overall normal guy in the situation, believes and is on the side of Frankenstein because Frankenstein is normal. Frankenstein has the pretty privilege over the monster. That was, to me, the big thing that came out of this. Certainly I went into reading Frankenstein knowing kind of the general feelings of the public about the novel. But really that's what really stood out to me. It was this idea of normalcy and pretty privilege, and we're inclined to believe that we are a hideous, wretched thing. And that's that. Frankenstein took me a couple days to read. If I had read it in one sitting, I could have absolutely done it. I wasn't feeling like reading a whole lot. Yeah, I think this is the last book before I restart, and then I got a whole bunch of Shakespeare to get through, which we'll see, I guess. Oh, the numbers rating. I mean, I'm gonna take a look at this. In my classics section that I've curated, I would put this between Grapes of Wrath and Slaughterhouse-Five, in terms of how much I'd be willing to reread it. So whatever. I think that puts like a 7.5, maybe. I don't know. 7.5, I guess.